This week, you're going to look at the concept of showing as opposed to telling in your short stories. Basically, showing is creating images using words and telling is summary. For the most part, showing is preferable because it allows the reader to become part of the action. However, there will be times when you need to give a lot of information in a short space, and that is when you will use telling. A short story can be nothing but showing and be very effective, but if a story is all telling, very few people will read it, and none of them will feel the better for having read it. The difference between the two is similar to the difference between your grandfather sharing a story about flying an airplane in the Vietnam War and a movie about fighter pilots. Your grandfather is going to summarize and give few details. The story will be short, to the point, and he'll explain things such as terminology that you may be unfamiliar with. This is an example of telling. The movie about fighter pilots will visually bring the audience into the story. It will be filled with images, dialogue, and physical action. In a movie, we experience the story as it transpires. This is showing. Our fiction needs to create a vivid image of the movie in the imagination of the reader. In The Art of Fiction, John Gardner states, "A scene will not be vivid if the writer gives too few details to stir and guide the reader's imagination." Take a look at the following example. Blair watched one of the monks go to the vehicle, get out a 5-gallon container, and return to the man seated in the street. The man poured gasoline over the monk sitting on the pillow, who struck a match. He burned up and didn't even look human anymore. This is all telling, and while it tells us what happens, it doesn't give us vivid or sufficient details. Compare that to the following. Blair turned his attention to one of the monks as he went to the vehicle, opened the trunk, and returned carrying an opaque 5-gallon container to the man seated in the street. Blair whispered under his breath, "What on earth?" as he witnessed the man pouring an orange liquid over the monk sitting on the pillow. The journalist heard the photographer say, "Gasoline," but before his mind had time to process the word, the venerable one, in a movement that went almost unnoticed, with one hand gently sliding across the other, struck a match. He erupted into flames. The gasoline burned with a crackling sound rushing up his torso and engulfing his body in an orange flame. For a moment his head was totally consumed by fire. Then a breeze whipped the flames, exposing the burnt, tortured features of what was slowly ceasing to be a man's face. In the first part, we're told what Blair sees. However, in the second example, we get a detailed description of the monk's immolation. We often hear the adage, "show, don't tell," and that is good advice, but there is a point where showing can be too much. I once wrote a short story about a divorce, and in it the courtroom was supposed to look similar to the church the couple had married in. The comparison covered a full single-space page and was carefully detailed down to comparisons of smells and the feels of the benches. Upon completion of the story, I gave it to my wife to read, and she commented that the descriptions were so detailed that she forgot what the story was about. In other words, I had overdone the details of the setting to the point they had become a distraction to the storyline. I had to go back and revise this one page down to 2 sentences. While overdoing showing can be a drawback, and telling can make the story too bland, one of the greatest risks of telling too much is when the author kidnaps the reader and the story. Paulo LaRocque tells us the main difference between telling and showing is telling interrupts while showing creates a convincing picture. We don't want the authorial voice to be present in the story at all. The writing needs to be about the story and not an expose of the writer's opinion. An example of this type of telling is, although Blair was a reporter and knew what he was supposed to do, he didn't write anything. He let the scene unfolding in front of him distract him from doing his job. He just stood there holding his pad in one hand and the pen in the other. He allowed the pungent black smoke pouring off the pyre in the middle of the intersection to interfere with doing what he was paid to do. The following example of showing relates the same scene, but allows the reader to interpret why Blair reacts as he does. Blair's mind instructed his hands to write. His right hand held the pencil poised on the pad resting in his left. Yet no movement came from his paralyzed fingers. His heart raced. Blood sank from his face to his knees, then rushed upwards, filling his head with a throbbing ache. Every breath was filled with the smell of incense, intermingled with the pungent black smoke pouring off the pyre in the middle of the intersection. As you write, consider the importance of showing and telling. Make an informed judgment on when to show and when to tell. Basically, using vivid details, showing draws the reader into the story, whereas telling does not involve the reader and may lead to a thorough interpretation. We want to tell when there is a lot of material that can just be summarized, or too many details might overwhelm the story. We want to show pretty much all the rest of the time. However, we need to use showing judiciously. Describing what a character is wearing or going into great details about insignificant aspects of the story can be as detrimental to the tale as too much telling can. The bottom line is we always need to ask ourselves, how is this going to affect the story, and is it serving the purpose of getting the main character to the resolution of the conflict? Keep writing and remember to have fun.